The final dressing for the notes is the orchestra, and that's what's contained in an orchestral score. Without the orchestra, it's a skeleton, and you simply clothe it with the orchestral colors. I'm doing this opera for a reduced orchestra of 25, and I've never really done an orchestral score for 25, but it's a very small number of instruments to balance. So I'm eliminating what we call the lower brass, except trumpet and horns. I'm a pianist, and that's the way I was schooled, and I find it much easier for me to start with the piano and then orchestrate from what I see on the printed page for the piano. What you learn as a composer, and you learn it very early, is the ranges of the instruments, how the instruments sound in registers, different registers, low, medium, and high. And then the most difficult and intricate of all is the combination of instruments, putting instruments together. How do oboes sound when put with flute? There is so much possibility for color. It's infinite. And yet when you do an opera, you have to constantly concern yourself with overbalancing the singers. It's an infinite number and variety of combinations. But that's also the joy of working with the orchestra. There is so much possibility for color. It's infinite.
Terrific. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is the third installment of our series, Masters at Work. And as so many of you know, Opera America has been a steady investor in the creation and production of new opera over the last 30 years. We've given nearly $15 million in grants in support of the creation and production of opera, and have run any number of professional development programs for composers and librettists. This particular series, in a way, touches both pieces of our mandate. We are speaking with the Dean of American Composers about the creation of his most recent opera, and we are delighted to know that we'll see in March Prince of Players at Houston Grand Opera. At the same time, this series captures in depth Carlisle's insights into the creation of an opera, creation of libretto, the piano vocal score, and today we're talking about the orchestration. So we're just delighted to have you here at the National Opera Center. We have students at the University of Houston, the College Conservatory of Music in Cincinnati, and Florida State University. They are linked to us via live stream and will be asking questions of Carlisle during the course of our time in the room here, but we'll invite your questions as well from among the audience, and there's a microphone right down center, and that's so the students can hear you at campus, and then all of this is being live streamed to a wider audience still. So we're using technology at a couple of different dimensions to make this a fully interactive and accessible program. So with that introduction, welcome back to your home away from home here at the National Opera Center.
Thank you.
And Happy New Year. This is the year of Prince of Players.
That's right.
So I'm really, really looking forward to it. We're here today to talk about orchestration. And to reveal my ignorance, I decided I would go to my computer and my Wikipedia screen just to look up orchestration. And as an orchestration is the study or practice of writing music for an orchestra, or more loosely, for any musical ensemble, or of adapting for an orchestra music composed for another medium. I like this last sentence. It said, only gradually over the course of music history did orchestration come to be regarded as a compositional art itself. So I don't know what it was before it was a compositional art, but there it was. It also said that orchestration describes the automated arrangement, coordination, and management of complex computer systems, middleware, and services. And I knew I had read too far at that point. So definitions of orchestration. What is orchestration?
I think of it as just the clothing of notes.
The clothing of notes.
Yes. I mean, you don't, that's the only thing that has to work with is notes that have been written. And they would be pretty impoverished without the addition of orchestration in many cases when it's intended for the orchestra.
I even heard you say in the video clip that without the orchestration, the music is just a skeleton, you said.
If it's intended for orchestra to begin with.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So the orchestration gives color, gives life, gives dimension.
Color is the very good word for it.
To the notes. Now, you are someone who composes first at the piano,
mm-hmm.
and then you orchestrate.
Mm-hmm.
There are some composers who just compose in full orchestration. What is your preference? What is your advice about starting from the piano score and then orchestrating?
Well, I think I'm probably duplicated by a number of composers who do it the way I do it, but probably all of us were pianists and who think pianistically to begin with before we make that transfer of the brain to the orchestra. In other words, it's familiar territory for us when we're at the keyboard.
Mm-hmm.
And also so much piano music really is almost an extraction into piano music from the orchestra. So it's up to the individual composer how he feels about his original instrument. Is it the orchestra or is it the piano?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it like me? I mean, I do it first of all at the keyboard, but with the idea that it will be immediately transferred. Well, not immediately, but it will be transferred into the orchestra.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. From a practical point of view, I imagine it's just much easier to make changes and to adjust. And if you have to throw something out, wouldn't you rather throw it out with just piano under it than having to make changes from a full orchestral score?
Oh, yes, certainly that. But I don't start scoring until I'm pretty sure of what I have in the way of having written a vocal score.
Mm-hmm.
Because I score from the vocal score.
And because in our last conversation when you were talking about the piano vocal score, you mentioned the Verdian reference to the tint, to the color of each scene. So is the color already in the piano vocal score, or does the color derive from the orchestration?
I'm tempted to say it's already in the score, waiting to be brought out by the composer in terms of instruments. But that doesn't mean that it can't have a life of its own as a piano score. Certainly that's what our life is in the opera world until the orchestra takes over. All the rehearsals are done with piano,
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which means that there's a piano reduction for an opera as soon as it's complete. Now, how that's achieved, whether it's the composer or whether that's been farmed out to someone else to do, that's a matter of individual preference.
You know, we in our New Works Forum over the past couple of years, we have done readings of new works in different phases. So we've started with a libretto reading to hear the libretto. And then we've heard the libretto with piano accompaniment. Mm-hmm. And then finally, we've heard it with orchestral ensemble. And it has been fascinating to me how the work has changed at every one of those iterations. And works that I thought weren't really going anyplace, listening to the piano vocal rendition, took on and were compelling with the orchestral ensemble underneath. Is it possible to take the full measure of a work before it's been orchestrated?
I don't think so. Not if the composer's intention for the final version is the orchestra. Of course, I don't really know of any composer right now who writes purely for piano accompaniment.
Yeah.
But I get, for instance, in my own particular case, I get more and more requests for performances of my operas, fully staged, but with piano accompaniment. And I grant most all of them. I have to authorize this, and it's certainly not my choice. But I figure if that's the only way they have of hearing an opera of mine, and they do a very good job with a good pianist, it's an introduction, at least, to the work. So I with almost no exception, I authorize that. But that doesn't mean that that's the ideal circumstance. It's not. As soon as a listener hears, let's say, a piano version set against an orchestral version, he will be struck just by the vast changes of color of sound, just by the pure volume that's given to the orchestra, and the tremendous range of color that's available through the orchestra.
And tension and other layers of meaning.
Yes.
When I think of the great composers, I think of a kind of sonic signature for each of them, that we can immediately identify a composer from the sound of the instrumentation, whether it's Mozart or Beethoven or Handel or Brahms. Do you have an orchestral signature?
Ask someone else.
It's so many,
I suspect I do. I suspect,
but not one you're conscious of?
No, not really. If I thought about it, I would probably agree with you. Yeah, there's a sonic sound that I go to over and over again for the expression of the same emotional condition, or it depends, or certainly a high degree of emotional tension. I probably do tend to rely on certain parts of the orchestra for that, even to certain statements.
What do you mean by that, certain statements?
Well, I was trying to give you an example other than mine, but I think if you look through Puccini, for instance, you'll see certain things that he may do over and over again when the condition is right, when it's part of what's being expressed with the singer on the stage. You'll find that he comes in with certain there's just certain compositional underwriting, so to speak, that you can expect from him. It's not the same notes, but it may be scored in the same way.
Even if it is The Girl of the Golden West or Madame Butterfly, which in terms of cultural references couldn't be more different.
Yeah.
There still is his sonic solution to particular situations.
Absolutely.
When you're writing, and that's
a very good example, by the way, of just what we're talking about and how far afield it goes. Because we're talking about California versus wherever Madame Butterfly takes place, but it certainly is not America.
Yeah. Because it was actually a question from Florida State University, and I am rephrasing this question, but the student asked, when orchestrating a particular opera, do you tend to orchestrate it in a style that is reminiscent of the setting, like Susanna, or do you orchestrate it in a style that is Floydian? Which made me think of, oops, that's a Floydian slip, but
there are a lot of Floydian slips, I promise you. Yeah.
So how much, do you think of, this is Susanna's sound world, or this is Kiniston's sound world, as in Prince of Players, or is it certainly colored by the Floydian approach?
Well, if there's an Floydian approach, and it would be nice to think there was, I would say the latter.
Mm-hmm.
Was that your latter one?
Mm-hmm. That is Floydian.
Yeah. I think what that says is that for the composer, there's a certain internal response to a dramatic situation, which he encounters over and over if he writes more than one opera. And your response to that may be, in a sense, similar from opera to opera. I think you see this in Puccini all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And something that's very interesting that happened to him compositionally was how few set pieces there are in Puccini, although we think of him as among the most lyrical of all composers. But in Butterfly, you
Mm-hmm.
have a duet, and you
Mm-hmm.
have Un Bel Dì, and you have the flower song,
Mm-hmm.
and that's it, pretty much for set pieces. But there's nevertheless certain windings of the melodic line
Mm-hmm.
that always stamp out, this is Puccini.
Yep, absolutely.
And so you know it.
And we have Florida State on the screen. I paraphrase the question, and is the student present who asked that question about the Floydian solution versus the Susanna sound world?
No, the student.
Okay, well, you just tell that student we answered the question. Let's talk about instrumentation, because when we think of Wagner and the sounds of his heroes, always that wonderful mixture of horns and lower brass. Mozart and his use of horns, and emotionally what that conveys to the depth of his characters. Do you also favor instruments, or do you have instruments that have special significance for emotion or for drama?
Yeah, I think so. I find the English horn a wonderfully plangent sound that I would never use in a joyous situation. It's always something, as I said, plangent, or just something that's always connected with a certain amount of sorrow, or a situation that's disturbing or upsetting emotionally. I find that I love using the English horn. You can't use it that often, or it loses its particular kind of poignance, which is built into the sound of the instrument. That would be one, certainly, and the most immediate one that comes to my mind. But so I think I do. I mean, you have, if you've done it as long as I have, you have a certain kind of catalog built into your head about what comes to mind to project it orchestrally.
Did you have to come up with a new or different vocabulary because Kynaston is set in such a different time and place than your usual work?
No, I didn't take that tack. I was not going to write a period piece that was restricted to music of that period, of which, incidentally, for those of you who don't know any differently, it's the 16th century. I beg your pardon, the 17th century, 1600s. But I didn't want to do a piece that was restricted to the musical practice of that period. At the same time, I have several deliberate set pieces that are there to give color of the period to the opera, and to tell us that we are in addition to the costumes, which I saw last night, which are wonderful, that we are not in present day New York, that we are obviously in England and in London, in the 17th century.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been interesting for me to try to give touches of that acquaint of the audience with where they are all the way through, and gives it its own kind of idiom
Mm-hmm.
for maybe a short period of time. But I have one little very short arietta that I wrote first, and then got the words from my niece Jane. But I knew what I wanted, and I had come up with the title, "My Johnny Has Asked Me to Marry Him," which sounded kind of like an Elizabethan or earlier poem.
Mm-hmm.
And that resulted in a very short little folk song, which this woman sings at an audition.
Mm-hmm. And we'll leave it up to a PhD student in the future to decide whether that folk song actually is tinted by your Carolina roots.
Yeah.
Given the fact that, unlike composers of the last century or 2 centuries ago, you are fluent in the compositional styles, techniques of every great composer who's come before you. When you're sitting down and orchestrating, and you're looking at a problem, finding a solution for it, do you think about what your compositional ancestors have done or would do, or are you able to just lock that out of your brain?
The latter. I don't really think of it. I don't think of any instance. Now, I'll probably come up with some tonight while I'm trying to go to sleep. But, no, I don't think so.
Now, you mentioned night and going to sleep, and this is completely coincidental, but I have to give a lecture tomorrow on Bizet, and I was reading a whole lot of Bizet material, and I came across this. And this is a letter from Gounod to Bizet. And he says, "Don't hurry too much. Everything will come in its own good time. Don't rush into using an idea on the pretext that you might not be able to find another. 10 will occur to you for every one. Be severe with yourself, but above all, be calm. Hurrying only stifles everything. And if I were to give you just one piece of advice, it would be not to work at night. It shrivels and contracts the mind, and that feverish kind of work leads, most of the time, to only one thing: dissatisfaction the next day, and a consequent need to start the previous day's work all over again." So there's Gounod to Bizet. Do you agree with the be calm, don't rush, don't think any one idea is the last one you'll have, and don't compose at night?
Well, I have composed at night, so I'm, and I found it on the whole a pretty good time. I don't do it anymore. I don't do it any longer. Mm-hmm. But that was primarily because of my wife, who wanted a break from listening to me compose all day. So I've never gotten back to it. But I found it a pretty fruitful time to work. Mm-hmm. If you didn't go too late, but you feel a kind of relaxation at night, I think, that you don't have the same relaxation for during the day. At night, you feel like, well, I have tomorrow to do this. Therefore, I'll relax tonight and see what comes, mm-hmm. see what happens. Mm-hmm. So it's not the same push.
Okay, well,
to compose.
I hope Gounod is listening, and we'll change his point of view. I hope Gounod is listening.
Oh, I hope he is too, because I think he's right.
It's a live stream, but who knows how far the signal goes. So there is a question from Houston, and that is, what is the first thing you do when you look at blank pages of score? Where and how do you start?
Well, I'm assuming that you have something in your head when you sit down to write, and you're looking at a blank page, that you have something to transfer from your brain to the paper. And most of the time, I think that's when you should have a conference with yourself and just say, well, now what do I really want here? What's the prevailing musical atmosphere that we've talked about so much? The teen time.
Mm-hmm.
What does that tell me? And what kind of teen time? What does that tell me about the mood of the piece? I mean, is it something very sad? Is it something very troubled? Is it something very exalted? And as soon as you start running yourself through these possibilities, you'll probably very soon come up on the, what's that song? I mean, that program with the, the arrow that goes around and stops at a certain place.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's what
Wheel of Fortune. That's it.
Huh?
Wheel of Fortune.
Wheel of Fortune. That's it. I watch it. And I think that's what happens when you start doing that, when you're sitting down, going through possibility. You simply say, well, first of all, I don't think you should sit down unless you have a pretty good idea of what you want. You just simply haven't found the notes for it.
Pretty good sense of what you want in terms of
emotional,
not a melody, but emotional atmosphere.
Well, it can be melodic. That would be even
easier. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have Houston on the screen. Is there a follow-up question about getting started? That moment of looking on a blank score page?
No.
Okay, I've got plenty more here. You mentioned both in the video and you've said it before about not drowning out the singers. So how do you not do that? Is it just trial and error over time? Are there rules to follow that when you've taught composition that you teach about how to achieve a workable balance between the voice and the orchestra?
Well, of course, there are a number of ways that are good, and there are a lot of ways that you should avoid. And generally speaking, it's staying out of the register of the singer. But that can have its problems also. If you put a soprano, for instance, in the middle register and then give her a very heavy overload of treble, then the middle voice probably will get lost.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also a question of thickness of texture. Can the voice cut through thickness of texture? I learned more from my opera Susanna than I ever did from an orchestration book. I learned for my next opera what to do.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least I got a start on that, because it's an endless process to find out how to compose for voice and orchestra. But speaking generally, I would say it's a matter of staying out of the register of the voice, if possible. One thing that works, I can tell you from just doing it in my latest opera, is putting the voice on top of the music rather than in the same register of the music.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's pretty much sure fire that you'll get a pretty good balance if you do that. Depending, I mean, if you've got 3 trombones against it, no.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, if you just have normal orchestration of strings and winds,
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You're thinking then of keeping your voice out of the way of the musical texture.
Mm-hmm.
So there are things like that you come up with as you work with it and see it in practice. See what works and what doesn't. I think I learned more about that having done an opera first, and then I had never done an opera before, and seeing what worked and what didn't.
Were there some Floydian slips in Susanna?
Oh yes. Yeah. Don't ask me to name them. That's all.
So it is both.
It's heavily scored.
But it's both. It is rules and then trial and error and practice.
Yes.
When it
But
comes,
the more trial and error, the more rules that come as a result.
Yeah, for sure. In terms of instrumentation and character, do you generally identify a character more with melody or more with instrumentation? How do we know what character is on stage at a given moment? Do we hear it through melody or do we hear it through instrumentation? That kind of almost signature for that character.
I think it's the signature.
A melodic one or an instrumental one?
Both. The melodic one can be spread over several instruments, but it's I think it's always the same thematic interest, not the same thematic interest, the same thematic idea, because that has to have infinite variation. But it can be accompanied by different things that give it a feeling for one emotion over the other. So you can give it say a quartet of strings, or you can give it a quartet of, if it's a strings, then can you do it an octave lower and give yourself the space, and then that can afford you the luxury of using heavier instrumentation if you have more space between the instruments and the voice, unless it's a very big heavy brass section. But then there are certain voices that cut through that wonderfully.
Now, what is you mentioned that you're composing for a smaller ensemble, that you have 25 pieces as opposed to twice or 3 times that many.
Yeah.
Is it really more challenging to have fewer instruments to choose from? Is it simpler because of the economy that you have?
Well, you just took it away from me. Because it's challenging, and once you do it, it's simpler. Because you've seen that, in other words, the economy of what you've done works. If you're convinced of that, if you've done something as a challenge, well, I've got to get the voice here out over the instrumentation. What is the instrumentation? Let's just say it's a wind and strings, which is very common in writing for voice. Okay, well, where are they in the registers? You figure that too. And can I afford that much orchestral weight that high? Because once you get into the upper registers for the voice, for voice and orchestra, you have to be very careful about covering and having the voice and orchestra in the same register. It doesn't usually work out very well.
So with 25 pieces, you are less likely to cover the singer.
That's true.
Unless all the pieces are brass, which of course they're not.
Well, you might like to know that I've never done an orchestra work for 25 pieces before. I did one once for, I think, 13 or 14, and that's really tough. But I had never done one for a medium-sized small orchestra like this one. And it's a constant problem when you're doing it, because you're limited. You're limited. You would like to use this, but I don't have that available here. So what's the second thing in it that I can bring up? But I think I found that once I just established the fact that this is what I was going to do, and this is what my contract had held me to, it's a kind of interesting and challenging challenge.
A kind of a puzzle. A kind of puzzle.
Puzzle, yeah.
How did you select those 25 instruments? Did they say you have these instruments, or did you say, okay, if I have 25, this is the instrumentation I want?
It depends where you are in terms of register. I mean, what do you need for the voice?
Mm-hmm.
Where is the voice?
But even when you knew you only had 25 instruments,
Mm-hmm.
how did you choose which 25 you would work with?
You start with la tinta. What do I need to project that color?
Mm-hmm.
How is that best achieved with the instruments I have at hand?
Mm-hmm.
And then you go from there. So it's a matter of choosing constantly.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to start with, first of all, what you want, what you need for the given emotional or theatrical moment.
Yep. Laura Lee tells me there is a question from Florida State University. So let's go to Florida State, and please tell us who you are and ask the question.
Sure. Hello, my name is Justin. I'm a doctoral student here. Do you often compose your operas in order from top to bottom, or do you ever work out of order as you are inspired by the specific text?
The question, Carlisle, is whether you go from beginning to end of the opera, or do you sometimes skip and go to another portion, work backward? What's the order you take the composition in and the orchestration in?
I go straight through.
You go straight through, even with the orchestration?
Oh, particularly with the orchestration, yes.
And why do you say particularly with the orchestration?
Well, so much of the work has been done by the time of the orchestration.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, after all, you've got the music written, you've got the libretto written, and to adorn it with the orchestra is more of a challenge in some ways and less of a challenge in others.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There is a question also about your role as a teacher, and it's interesting in reading the biography of Bizet, the same question came up. Do you find that your students sometimes take on your sound because you're the teacher? If that happens, how do you interrupt that?
I accuse them of it. And
so it does happen.
It does happen. And inevitably, the real smart Alex say, well, I just wanted to copy something good, you know. and they think that's just going to undo you with gratitude. And as a counter to that, I'm trying to say, I don't like it. If I can recognize me in their music, then it doesn't do any good to say I'm imitating the better one.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I want them to find out what their particular voice is, and so I lead them away from that. Some of them are very good at it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Not that many really, but I've had some that I will say, you know where that comes from, don't you? And then they'll say yes and smile. But I don't encourage it, and I will recognize it and make a comment about it if I feel that it's happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There is another question. It's from Florida State. So if we get to Florida State, and please again, your name and the question.
Hi, I'm Noah. I'm a sophomore in music composition here at FSU. My question is, since other orchestrators are typically hired in time, money, etc., how do you help ensure that you get to compose and orchestrate throughout the duration of the process?
And your voice did fade in and out on that one, and I'm not able to hear enough of it to translate it for Carlisle. Can you ask that question again, and perhaps in the control room, can we get the volume up a little bit? That would be great. So take it again from the top.
Of course.
That's much better.
All right. Since other orchestrators are typically hired in the interest of time, money, etc., how do you personally help ensure that you compose and orchestrate throughout the duration of the process?
Wow.
Question about orchestrators. The mic is still cutting in and out, but I think the question, if I'm correct, was that so many composers contemporarily use orchestrators. How do you maintain your overview and your voicing control through the entire orchestration process? Is that correct?
That is correct.
Well, of course, Carl. Thank you, Laura Lee. Laura Lee is a linguist, and but you don't use an orchestrator. You just do it all yourself.
Yeah.
Do you know composers who do use orchestrators, and what's your experience of the orchestrator in the role of
Well, I mean,
music?
it happens on Broadway all the time.
Sure does.
And there is great veneration for the people who orchestrate
Mm-hmm.
the score, but that's for a different kind of writing, different kind of music. That's show music, and that's not to be discouraged one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a different brand. It's a different world we're in terms of what's required.
Mm-hmm.
And there are not that many of very good orchestrators, or those who've made big careers at it.
Mm-hmm.
There are some, and I've met some of them, and well, for instance, oh gosh, what is his name? Our leading music theater man.
Oh, Andrew Lloyd Webber or Stephen Sondheim?
Stephen Sondheim uses an orchestrator all the time, and he swears by it.
Mm-hmm.
Something that might amuse you all, I did an opera called Willie Stark some years ago, based on the great novel of Robert Penn Warren, called All the King's Men. But it's the story of Huey Long and that period in American life. And I did an opera, and it was staged by Hal Prince. And I had the very great pleasure and privilege of working with him. And I remember he told me this about Stephen. And so he was on the phone one day with him, and he says, Stephen Carlisle does his own orchestration. And I said, thank you a lot. Stephen is a good friend of mine. But I don't know that endeared him to me.
That's very funny.
But there is and I suspect they have a lot of twists in terms of their own. They just fall into because of the genre.
Yeah. Now, since the Academy Award nominations were just announced the other day, it made me think, you know, orchestration is such an important part of movies. But the music in a movie tends to support and describe in a secondary way, where music in an opera has to drive it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you can describe how you achieve music that drives and defines the drama, as opposed to just being sort of in the background helping it along.
You know how to answer difficult questions. I mean, ask them, not answer them. It has to do with a number of things. It has to do, first of all, the demand for it in the libretto. Does it drive? How long a period of time does it drive? If it's let's say a long section, what can you say, 3 or 4 pages, then you have to have certain technical skills at your disposal in terms of how to keep all that together and keep it driving at the same time. Now, the past master of that, of course, is Wagner,
Mm-hmm.
who could do that. I mean, Verdi could do it also, but in a more concentrated way.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to have, first of all, the drive that comes from the libretto. Otherwise, you'll fall into the trap
Mm-hmm.
of trying to introduce too many musical ideas. But and the other thing that's absolutely requires is that you have the compositional skill to keep your idea afloat for that length of time. Now, the past master of this, of course, is all Puccini. It certainly is Puccini. You look at Tosca and the second act of Tosca with the clarinet idea. Dee dum bum 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 ba da dum. See how long he uses that and how much mileage he gets out of that. It's extraordinary. But you have to know, first of all, you have to have an interesting idea, and you also have to have the compositional skill to show that idea in various, what can I say, various faces. Is it shown with tension accumulating around it, or is it relaxing? You've got to always know where you are in terms of going forward, and how fast are you moving forward, and where are you moving to.
And it's interesting because in contrast, you know, a movie score is not linked to the libretto. It's not linked to the text in quite the same way. It is.
Well, it was in the 1930s and 40s, but there's a good reason for that. They had the wonderful composers who came from Europe, who were very highly trained as composers, and they could take an idea and spin it indefinitely. But it has a different sound than that of today. It was almost symphonic, so much of it, because they were taking their guide from Wagner, obviously from Verdi, but the whole idea was to be able to keep musical ideas aloft, and also begin to expand on them or show them in different ways. Like I was just referring to the Tosca example. That's is not on the face of it a great theme, but it's a theme that alerts you, it pulls you in, because it moves very quickly when it makes its statement. And that's something that I'm trying to also let you know about. It's the character of the theme itself. How fast does it move? Now that one moves sporadically. Dum, dum, bum, bum. Now he's not finished. Ta 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 dum. And that's what you've been driving through since the beginning. And then that gives you thematic material to work with and continue and to expand and to show it in various guises with different instruments. Because once we've got ticka-ticka-dum in our heads, we know where we're going to or coming from.
And it's wonderful to hear you narrate that. I so can follow what you're saying with that.
Oh, do you?
Absolutely. Now, what about, we're talking about composition, generally orchestration, of course, here. You take your cue from the text, you take your cue from the tinta, the tint of the scene. For concert music, it must be much more difficult where you don't have the text or the character or the tint of a dramatic moment to sit down and say, what am I going to say melodically or theme and variations? It's a much blanker slate, isn't it?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Much more challenging.
Very difficult, because you've got to get your impetus from a different source. If your impetus comes from a story or a libretto, you have part of your work already done for you, so that you can pretty much know what the extent of the scene is going to be, and what that suggests, like that one delayed line I quoted of Puccini. What is interesting in that line is the fact that he stretches the theme, dee da da dum, all the way there, and then he gives you the payoff, ta ta da da dum. Well, that suddenly that gives tension to the scene that he's building for it.
Yeah.
and he uses it very efficiently and well and long in that act.
Laura Lee, we have a question from CCM from Cincinnati. Let's get to the screen. Tell us, please, who you are and what's your question.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Grace. I'm a second-year dramatic student. And I wanted to ask, have dramatic discoveries in the rehearsal process of a new work ever changed the orchestration?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. So when you have seen an opera then in rehearsal, you know, and you hear the orchestra, you're watching it in rehearsal, or even before you hear the orchestra, does the dramatic truth that emerges through rehearsal ever make you go back and change the orchestration, where suddenly you've discovered a new or a different tint to the scene and you need to change what's in the orchestra?
I don't know that it has, but I wouldn't hesitate to do it.
Mm-hmm.
If I felt that I had chosen the wrong tint.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that a composer shouldn't be scared to go back and change that orchestration if, even in the late rehearsal process, something else is discovered.
No.
Okay.
If it's more effective, of course, it presupposes that you know what tint you're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And if you found one that is stronger and more dramatically gripping, like that one of the Puccini that I spoke about, you will go with that. But you first of all have to acknowledge the fact that the theme you have is not the maximum theme you could have.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'll say, what's weak in it? Is it thematically not as weak? Now, the Puccini theme that I quoted to you, it all hinges on that one section of 16th notes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it's just a series quarter notes, and you get to that, and suddenly and then you get into the tension of the scene itself, which is about as tense a scene as there is in opera.
It sure is. We have another question from Florida State University. Come in, Florida State. There we go.
Hello. I'm going to read this question close to a mic from Josh, who is sitting in the second row. He's a sophomore composition major. The question is, when you are reviewing music you've written, do you ever discover excerpts that sound like other composers or works?
Mm-hmm.
Does this prompt you to rewrite?
It's a great question, and I know operas I've attended where I've been struck by that. Carlisle, are you ever struck where, okay, you're in rehearsal and you hear your music, and suddenly you become aware that in fact it's almost a musical quote of another composer's work, that somehow coincidentally, not intentionally, you have so caught someone else's idea that you need to go back and rewrite?
I don't think it's ever happened to me, but I would certainly not. I would not hesitate to do it if I felt like it was too obvious and too literal a restatement of something that was already stated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, not unless I did it intentionally, but I can't imagine doing that, frankly.
Right, right. Questions in the room? If you come up to the microphone, please, Bill, or go for it, and then Bill.
Hi.
Tell us your name and quick question.
My name is Stephanie. So this is a two-part question. As a pianist, how did you learn to orchestrate? And then also, once you have your piano reduction complete for an opera, how long does the orchestration process take? And is that process longer than writing the piano reduction or shorter?
So, how did you learn how to orchestrate since you were a pianist first?
Well, I have an ear. Thank goodness. And that ear provided me with colors of a particular section that I had written. and what's the prevailing color of the scene, and we go back to Latin to there. But you always work from the prevailing musical thematic idea in a scene, which presumably comes to you from what you have made of the dramatic undercurrent of the whole scene. Now, that doesn't mean a full orchestral scene. Doesn't have to be that. It can be something much smaller than that. But you would nevertheless try to encapsulate it in one prevailing scene that you use with different guises in that scene itself until it exhausts itself.
Did you study orchestration at conservatory?
Yes, I had a semester of it.
Is that all it would have taken? I would have been a composer if I had known it would take one semester.
Well, I can't say that. The only thing I learned from it, which is something that you have to learn, I learned nothing but the ranges of instruments. That was what we were taught that we had to learn first, was the range of every instrument in the orchestra, and what it was like and what its sound quality was like in those various ranges. What were those instruments most compatible with in terms of other instruments, and just practical things like that were basically what I did and what the class consisted of. And that's all important to know. However, it's just a beginning. And it doesn't really deal with what we've been talking about today, which is adapting or using music to further dramatic atmosphere on the stage.
Bill, you had a question?
Yes, this is related to being a librettist yourself for your own pieces. For a composer who uses another libretto, you react to that, and then the color of the orchestration may come. So when you're writing a libretto, does the color of what the orchestration is going to be sort of happen simultaneously as you're writing the text?
Do you hear the orchestration sort of, kind of, as you're writing the text itself?
It can happen, yes. It can happen.
And then do you write a note to yourself, put trombones here, or do you just come back to that naturally?
I come back to it naturally, yeah.
Fascinating.
Once it's established in my head, then I come back to it.
There's a question from Cincinnati, which will probably be our last of the afternoon. Hello, Cincinnati.
Hi there. My name is Marcus Shields. I'm a first-year acting student. And my question is, in the case of an like Susanna, there is a reduced registration that makes the piece more accessible to educational institutions, and smaller companies have the orchestral force of a larger house. Do you often orchestrate with the thought of accessibility in mind?
Great. The size of your orchestra can influence what companies can produce the work. And there are orchestral reductions of some of your works. When you are composing, are you thinking about producibility at the same time, or are you thinking purely creatively?
Thinking purely creatively. I know in advance what my limits are in terms of most orchestras in this country, that is opera orchestras, that more or less 55 is it. That's pretty much as much as you have used or can expect to use. But that doesn't mean that people will also can reduce an orchestra down to 30, or the Broadway orchestra is usually 25. And still it's an effective orchestra. It does what it's supposed to do. What you lose is texture and changes of color that way.
But you go for your the full realization of your creative impulse.
That's right.
Do you also do your own orchestral reductions if someone wants a smaller orchestration? Will you go from 55 to 30, or will you leave it to someone else to do that?
I'll leave it to someone else.
Okay.
And it hasn't been terribly satisfactory so far.
Oh, well, that's a reason that you should undertake it.
Yeah.
Well, I know that we are at the end of our hour, and that for our conservatories, that is generally the end of class time. I want to thank everyone in Cincinnati and at Florida State and in Houston for being a part of this. And I want to thank our audience here at the National Opera Center for being present for this third installment of our Masters at Work series with the great, the gracious, the generous, the dear friend, Carlisle Floyd. Thank you so much. Thank you. As always. Thank you.